Hi everyone, today we're going to be looking at skill classification for GCSE paper, which is paper 2. We're going to be looking particularly at the continuums of open and closed, basic and complex, high organisation and low organisation. So just before we start going, we've got to remember that when we look at skill classification, we are looking at the two extreme ends of where you would put a skill. So if you think of it as a continuum, if you looked at, for example, a continuum where you might have happy on one end and sad on the other end, and every emotion between happy and sad would go along that continuum. We have the same for open and closed, basic, complex skills, high organisation and low organisation. So looking at the first one, we have open and closed. Now, the exam boards tend to want you to always put an example and know an example of an open skill and a closed skill. So generally, you're going to be looking at activities, and these are ones I've pulled off the exam board, the exam papers. So in the past they've used just netball as an example, a whole sport. They tend not to go with a sport in your examples, okay? Tend to go with a sport specific skill. But in general, you could probably pick most skills in netball as an open skill. Football dribbling, goalkeeper saving a shot. In this case, they've used hockey goalkeeper, but you could use a football goalkeeper or handball goalkeeper as your example, and or someone making a rugby tackle. And then other closed examples that they've used regularly is shot put, handstands, some high diving somersaults, which again could be replaced by gymnastic somersaults, trampoline somersaults, javelin throwing and tennis serves. So just make sure you're very clear of the different sports examples that you can have when you're asked to classify whether it's open and closed. The other type of scenario you might be given is a skill that's already placed on a continuum and you have to justify where it is. But more often than not, you'll have the open and closed continuum shown to you and you have to then allocate a skill. It could be a multiple choice question where it gives you which of these is most likely to be an open skill or which of these most likely to be a closed skill, and then it'll give you scenarios and then you have to select the ones. But like I say, these are the ones that in the previous past exam papers have come up. Okay, so when we're looking at open and closed skills, we want to be thinking about how we define them. So generally what you would be asked is give an example of an open and closed skill and then give a definition of them, or vice versa. So they're pretty much opposites when we're looking at these continuums. So as long as you can remember one side, try to remember the reverse of the other side. So generally we want to talk about the environment and the stability of the environment. So the keywords that the exam board likes to use is unpredictable or unstable environments for an open skill, where there may be some external factors influencing the skill. Okay, so wind might have an effect, rain might have an effect. Don't be tempted just to always go with the weather. Could be the influence of a crowd. It could be the positioning of opposition and your own teammates, which I'll mention in a second. In an open skill, the environment is constantly changing, so players will always need to react and adapt their performance to the environment that is changing for them. So example would be like you're reacting to where your players are on the pitch, where your opposition players are. So again, generally these tend to be sort of team sports. There are some exceptions of individual sports, but generally you're looking at a team sport scenario. A closed skill, remember we're looking at skills, not sports, is where the environment is stable and it's quite predictable. So it's the same thing over and over again. They don't really have much external factors, so the action is repeated over and over again. If you're thinking of something like a tennis serve, which is one of the examples the exam board use, even though the environment can be open, the actual serve is more or less the same in most situations, the same actions, depending on where you want to put the serve, but generally the same actions, and I'll talk about that next slide down. And you're not reacting to an environment, so things like a forward roll in gymnastics where there's no changes in conditions, the movement is the same movement pattern, they tend to be closed skills. So this is an example of an exam question where they've given you the skill of a tennis serve and they've placed it already on the continuum, and then they're asking you to justify why it isn't at the fully closed end. Now if you had this exam question and it gives you, and it doesn't have to be open or closed, it could be any of the continuums, but in this scenario it's open and closed. You start off with sort of justifying why it is at the closed end. So in this case, we're talking about a tennis serve is performed in a reasonably stable environment where there isn't limited effect of the environment. But then you go around and say something like it's not always identical and the conditions can change when serving. So you're saying, right, it's coming back over towards the open end. And then you've got to give some examples of why the conditions are changing. So, for example, there could be external factors such as the distractions of the crowd. You could have wind that affect the ball toss. The surface could be slippery. The example, do give an example of the skill, the technique can change in the sun. That's up to you if you would want to use that one. Now, I don't think it would be the exact same question. It might give you a different scenario, but give you the same sort of justification. It might say, why is a skill more at the basic end versus the complex end? And you do this, go through the same process. So say, why is at that top end, whatever the scenario is, given a sort of statement to say it isn't always the case, and a slight reason why, like i.e. conditions can change, or that it's not fully at that end for whatever reason you're looking, depending on the example we're looking at, and then justify it with some backup examples. Sort of 3-mark question. So another sort of exam question that we've seen before is asking how a coach would organise their practice sessions for the open and closed skills. And you can notice that there's quite a lot on open and closed. It's probably one of the more likely ones to show up, but it doesn't mean it will definitely show up. If it was a basic and complex skill, you might want to adapt your answer for the similar sort of way. But it asks how you would practice these skills. Now, the first and easiest point is to say, if it's an open skill, practice in open conditions. If it's a closed skill, practice in closed conditions. And that's just really easy marks. And then you've got to give scenarios and examples of how you would set up that training to reflect open conditions or reflect closed conditions. So if we're looking at open, the sort of things you could be putting in place is putting pressure on the performers, and that could be in the terms of restricting time or putting time limits on it, or adapting timing of movements and things like that. Or you could look at introducing opposition. So it could be like an attacking drill where you start off with attack. And this is where varied practice comes in. With you start with an attacking scenario, and then you might put some defenders in place, and then you might restrict it to a 30-second time limit to try and create a goal scoring opportunity. But the idea is you're trying to get the players to learn how to adapt to game scenarios. And in closed conditions, really what you're trying to do is get the performance to be performed in the same way it would be in a competitive situation, where you're trying to get the replication. So it could be like I say, the example of tennis serve, or it could be a penalty where the footballer is taking the penalty, not the goalkeeper, the footballer, the penalty taker, and you're trying to repeat it over and over again. So you're ingraining how they would perform it in the game, and you're trying to prevent any distractions. So you're limiting what distractions are around them, so they learn how to block them out for the games. Okay, so we move on to now basic and complex skills. Now, a basic skill is a relatively simple skill. It's a skill that can be transferred across multiple sports, whereas a complex skill is one that is more difficult and is usually a bit more sport specific. So these sort of examples the exam board give are things like running, jogging, different forms of running, like such as jogging, marathon running, cross-country running, sprinting. So any running action. And if you have to answer an exam question, think of a running action. I would go a little bit more specific. So give it an example of marathon running, cross-country running, rather than just running. Cycling and throwing a ball. They're the typical exam question sort of scenarios and examples they give. And then complex skills, and if you notice, they're all quite specific. They have the name of the sport and then the skill in the sport. So gymnastic vaulting, rugby scrummaging, tennis serves, dribbling and hockey, and so on and so forth. So if you're thinking about it, think of the specific sport skills that are probably a little bit more difficult. And always have your own sport in your background. What's the sport you play and what sort of skill is slightly more difficult in that sport. And then if we get to the definitions now, as I said earlier, a basic skill is very simple to complete. It's less sport specific, so it's a generic skill that can be applied across multiple sports. And then we've got like two sort of sets of answers, and they're quite different to each other. They're opposites. So just remember one set and then think about the opposite for the other. So a simple skill. A basic skill is a simple skill where you don't have to think about it very much. You learn it very quickly and easily. Little concentration is needed, little thought about the movement, and less coordination. If you think about when you go running, you might have headphones on or listening to an audiobook or listening to music. You can have conversations when you're running. You're not thinking about the running because it's a basic skill. Where if you're doing a skill such as a tennis serve or a cover drive in cricket, as the example say, you can't have a conversation while you're doing those skills. You're actually thinking about those skills. So picture that in your head while you're doing these sort of answers. And again, complex skills, it's just the opposite. So you have to make lots of decisions. Needs a lot of practice. It's harder. It's difficult to perform. You need more concentration to perform it, more coordination. They have these elements where it's got a lot more bits to break down into the skill to learn it and subroutines. But we'll talk about that in a little bit more in organisation of skills. Now, this is probably the second most common area that they ask questions on. So usually it's open and closed is the most common, followed by basic and complex skills. So there's a very high chance that one of the exam questions will be focused on this area. And then that leads us to high organisation and low organisation. And like I alluded to earlier, less chance of this being asked. It is asked, but a little bit more rarely, usually on a multiple choice rather than an explanation. But that doesn't mean it won't come up in your answer with an explanation. So just apply what I've said about the other two areas and apply it to these ones. So high organisation, the only real example the exam board have given before is a golf swing. But think of a skill that's very fast and very rapid. But if you have to give your own example, think golf swing. In a low organisational skill, the typical ways is think about, can a skill be broken down into steps? So in backstroke swimming, you'd be using a float to work on the kicking action. Then you might do working on the arm action, not focusing on your feet, and then you put them together. Tennis serves, you might work on a throw of the ball in the air. Then you might work on the backswing. Then you might work on the connection and follow through, and you can break it down into its parts. So it's a skill that can easily be broken down into phases. If you take something like shot put, where you might go a standing throw, and then you might do a step, and then you can put a glide in place, and you can break it up into its parts. So it's a low organisational skill. Now the examples, the definitions are quite simplistic, but it's one that people tend to get confused and they can't remember what's high organisation and what's low organisation. And the only way that I really remember it is I look at low organisational skills, and I think it can be broken down into its phases. And I think, right, low has 3 letters and can has 3 letters, and that's the only way I remember it. Okay, so low organisational skills can be broken down into separate parts, whereas high organisational skills cannot be broken down into its parts. And again, I look at the 3-letter rule of low and can, and that's my basic way of remembering it. It's not the perfect way, but that's the way I remember it. If it works for you, brilliant, use it. If it doesn't, then let me know how you do it. Smaller parts, so in low organisational skills, their movements have little parts. You can put them together, but you can practice them individually, put them back together to complete the whole skill, whereas a high organisational skill is too fast, it's too rapid, it's too powerful, so you can't break it down into its parts easily. So try to remember those two definitions. But like I said, focus firstly on open and closed skills, because they're the most likely ones to come up. Then you've got the idea of basic and complex skills, the second most likely to come up, and then high and low organisational skills. It would be good practice to think about how practice structures could be organised for each of those different classifications, or how a skill might fit and move across that continuum, not be fully at one end. If this exam question comes up in your paper, good luck, and yep, definitely revise this, because skill classification comes up pretty much every year.